All right, so hi everybody. And for those of you who might be wondering, I am not Youssri Helmy. My name is Hideaki Oshima, and I am the Technical Product Manager at Eonite Reception. So unfortunately, Youssri had a last-minute conflict, so he wasn't able to attend today. So my apologies in advance if you're here solely to hear Youssri speak. I'm going to do my best to fill in for him. All right, so let's get right into it. So if you think about commercially available, oh, is it here? Okay, sorry about that. All right, so if you think about commercially available positional tracking solutions today, you might think about these products. So on the upper right, you have the HTC Vive. Right underneath it, you have the Oculus Rift. And on the left, you have a Vicon system. And these three products have one thing in common. They're each use what we call outside-in positional tracking technology. So for outside-in positional tracking, you basically place cameras or sensors inside your room, usually on opposing corners. And these cameras track either markers or LEDs that are placed on or inside the headset, the controller, or whatever object it is that you might be tracking. And they work great, right? So, I mean, they provide a high level of accuracy. And I mean, I'm sure many of you have tried these headsets before. So at least in my opinion, they provide a really nice, comfortable experience. But at the same time, they're not without their downsides. So first of all, you have to set up your external cameras or hardware. So you have to mount these cameras on your walls or inside your room. So there's a whole setup process that's involved. And second, because you have these hardware setup requirements, your play space is also restricted to the room where you have the cameras. So you can't just get up, walk around, and expect to play in another room. You have to stay in the room where you have the cameras. And lastly, if you have a user with his headset on playing a game in virtual reality, let's say his dog or his cat walks into the play space. There's really no way to detect dynamic obstacles or objects that might enter your play space. So that could cause some accidents, perhaps. And that's where inside-out positional tracking comes into play. So with inside-out tracking, the cameras are actually placed inside the headset. And based on what the cameras see, you're basically able to figure out where the user is in the context of the room. And if you think about it, this is a much more natural way of doing this. So if I were to be walking around on the stage, I'm not going to rip my eyeballs out of my sockets, glue them to the walls, and try to figure out where I'm going. My eyes are placed inside my head, I look out, and based on what I see, I'm able to navigate where I'm going. Okay, so what are the benefits of inside-out tracking? So first of all, as I mentioned, there's no external hardware setup required. You put on your headset and you go. And second, because you don't have the requirements for external hardware, you're not restricted to one room. So you can move from room to room, and basically your entire house becomes your play space, assuming your headset is not tethered to a PC. Third, as I mentioned earlier with the pet example, you can have, because you're able to see what's in front of you, you're able to do both static and dynamic obstacle detection. So you're able to see what's in front of you, and you're able to alert the user while he's in his headset. And finally, because you know what's in front of you, you can also have these mixed reality applications where you can overlay virtual objects onto your physical scene. Okay, and that all sounds great, right? But in reality, it's a really challenging problem. So if you think about it, you have a user with his headset on, and he's moving around in his space at a reasonably fast speed. And you really don't know what conditions the user is going to be in. So there could be different lighting conditions. There could be different obstacles in front of him. You have to be able to account for all of the different scenarios that a user might experience inside of his home. And your tracking has to be robust across all of those different conditions. So on this slide, we highlighted sort of 6 items that we thought were critical in order for inside-out positional tracking to be successful. So the first one on the upper right is latency. So in order to prevent VR motion sickness, you want your motion and photon latency to be very low, ideally below 20 milliseconds. And so in the context of inside-out tracking, you want to be able to get data out of your camera, you want to be able to compute your pose, and you want to pass that pose to your rendering engine as quickly as possible. Next, we have power. And for obvious reasons, you want to minimize your power consumption, especially when you're talking about mobile applications. Next, we have robustness. So as I mentioned earlier, your tracking has to work robustly across all of the different possible use case scenarios. And in the event that you do have a failure and you lose tracking, you should be able to recover very quickly. And next up, we have cost. Obviously, especially for consumer applications, you want to make sure the system is affordable for your average consumer. And then we have time to market. I mean, obviously, when is it available? I want it now, right? And finally, one of the most important elements is accuracy. So if you're placing a virtual object in front of the user, I mean, you don't want that object to be swimming around or shaking around in front of the user. So you want to minimize the amount of jitter that's on that object, and you want to ideally minimize that. You want your pose jitter to be less than 1 millimeter in order to be able to accomplish this. Okay, so let me dive a little more deeply into the accuracy aspect. So in the previous slide, I kind of simplified things a bit. So for those of you that don't know, so Eonite provides inside-out tracking software solutions to our OEM partners. And whenever we engage with the new clients, one of the first questions that always comes up is, what is your accuracy spec? And for me personally, I mean, I would love it if I could just give a one-word answer to this, where X millimeters accurate, and just be done with it. But in reality, it's a lot more complicated than that. So because at the very least, we have these 3 different measures of accuracy that we talk about. So the first one is repeatability. So if I sort of do a fixed motion in my physical space, that should always translate to the same motion in my virtual space. And that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be ground truth accurate, but in my physical space, if I move from point A to point B and back to point A, that should always translate to the same motion from point C to point D to point C in my virtual space. So you need your motion to be highly repeatable. The second measure of accuracy is jitter. So I mentioned earlier about the virtual object. You don't want it to be moving around. If it's a static object, you don't want it to be moving around in front of the user. So you want to minimize this jitter as much as possible. And lastly, we have ground truth accuracy. So this is probably most important for mixed reality type of applications, where you're overlaying virtual objects on top of your physical objects. In that case, if you're not ground truth accurate, if I place a coffee table on this podium, or sorry, not a coffee table, my virtual coffee mug on this podium here, you don't want that mug to be kind of buried inside the podium. You want it to be sitting firmly on top of it. And lastly, whenever you're talking about accuracy, I mean, you always have to specify under what conditions those numbers hold. So what kind of hardware are you using? What are your system settings? What's the environment? And how much motion are you applying to your system? So if you don't specify all of those things, I mean, the numbers sort of don't hold much meaning. So whether you're an OEM or a developer, whenever you're talking about accuracy, you should always keep in mind sort of under what conditions do those accuracy numbers hold true. Okay. And one last note on accuracy. So, I mean, I think for a lot of people, including myself, one of the things I struggle about when I'm kind of going through these numbers is how to sort of visualize or make sense of what the numbers mean. So if someone's telling me I have 1 millimeter translation accuracy and 1 millimeter rotation accuracy, or 1 milliradian rotation accuracy, sorry. I mean, what does that really mean, right? So for the translational part, I mean, I think it's pretty easy to grasp. Okay, you're off by 1 millimeter. But if someone tells me, we're off by 1 milliradian, it's sort of hard to quickly grasp what that means in the context of things. So typically for us, we kind of come up with a couple of quick approximations just to help process that number. So the first one is we'll equate 1 meter to 1 radian and just call it meters and radians, or MAR. And this actually holds to be, it actually turns out to be surprisingly accurate if you have objects that are 1 meter away. So if you have, for an object 1 meter away, if your error is 1 millimeter and 1 milliradian, you can just combine the two and call it 2 millimars. Just a quick and easy way to think of it. And more generally speaking, for objects that are a distance r away from you, so a small rotation can be sort of converted into a small displacement by multiplying that angle in radians by r. So just a couple of quick and dirty approximations just to help think of things in terms of maybe more translational units as opposed to rotation. All right, so up until now, I've kind of talked about all the requirements associated with tracking. But when you're talking about inside-out tracking, there's always sort of a scanning or a mapping process that has to precede it. So basically, if you want to figure out where you are in your room, you're not going to be able to figure out unless you have a map of your room or you know what space you're operating in. So this mapping process always has to precede your tracking. And so here we highlighted a few requirements that we feel are very important to have a seamless tracking or seamless mapping experience that's as transparent as possible to the user. So the first one is we have to be able to map in different environments. So earlier I talked about how your tracking has to work robustly across all of the different conditions that your user might experience in his home. So the same applies to mapping. So regardless of your lighting conditions, what kind of furniture you have in your room, what kind of space you're operating in, you should be able to map robustly without any sort of excessive inputs from the user. Second, you shouldn't require any interior changes. So one of the benefits of inside tracking that I highlighted earlier is that we don't require any external hardware setup. But at the same time, if you're asking the user to make changes to his room, that's going to eliminate that benefit. And third, the scanning has to happen in real time. So if you're telling your user to scan his room, and he does that, but then he has to wait another 10 minutes for all of your computation to complete, I mean, that's not going to fly. He should be able to just scan and start playing his game right away. And finally, it has to be a very quick and simple scanning experience. So ideally, it should be something like you turn left, you turn right, you have your map, and you're able to go. We put no loop closures there, but so in essence, you don't want to force your users to kind of do these specific motions or patterns in order to get your mapping to work. So you shouldn't have to ask your user to walk around in a circle in order for your process to complete. Okay, so I've talked about the requirements on the tracking and the mapping side. So you might be wondering, so where is this tech today, right? When do we get to see it? So I can't necessarily speak to all of the other providers out there, but I can speak to what Eonite has today. So for us, using these commodity depth sensors, we're able to achieve real-time home scale mapping and 3D reconstruction with sub-millimeter accuracy. So we have an example of a map there. And based on this accurate map, we're able to provide highly accurate inside-out positional tracking. And finally, because we have the accurate map and the accurate tracking, we're also able to provide mixed reality interaction capabilities. So we're able to accurately overlay these virtual objects onto the physical scene. And just to dive a little bit into our mapping procedures. So basically, because we have this highly accurate mapping process, this eliminates the need to do any loop closures. So if you look at the image here, wish I had a laser pointer. So you have, this is actually a top-down view of a map of our office. So you have 3 rooms, one big room to the left, a small room in the middle, and another bigger space on the right. So let's say I want to map the 2 rooms to the left. So I start in the big room, I walk around, I scan, I walk out the door, and I walk into the second room. But because there's a wall there separating the two rooms, oh, you have, oh, awesome, thank you. Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so you start here, you walk around, you scan, and then you come in, and then now you want to finish mapping here. If your algorithm requires loop closures, you really can't do it because there's a wall here, so you can't close that loop. But because we have highly accurate mapping, you could just finish here and we can faithfully reconstruct this wall here without having it collapse onto itself or expand excessively. The other benefit is we have real-time mapping. So there's no post-processing required. The map is built in real time and we're good to go. And lastly, we also have home scale capability. So you can walk from room to room to room, and you can build an accurate map of your whole house. All right, and some details about our head tracker. So I showed this slide earlier. It highlights what we feel are the 6 basic requirements to have successful inside-out head tracking. I'm not going to go through each one again, but suffice to say, our tracker is able to check the boxes for each of these elements. And lastly, a note on our mixed reality capabilities. So once again, because we have the accurate map and the tracking, we're able to accurately overlay virtual objects onto the physical scene. So you see the images here are snapshots of a demo that we have. As you can see, we're able to put the virtual objects into the scene with the proper occlusions and with the proper shadows. So if you look at the image on the right, you have a cabinet sitting on the floor, and it's placed behind the chair. So it's not kind of sinking into it, or it's not sitting on top of it. It's placed on the floor where it's supposed to be. Same with the puppy in the middle. So that cute little guy is kind of standing behind the furniture there. And lastly, the image on the left, you have a goblin placed firmly in the doorway, and he's casting a shadow on the door. And lastly, you really can't tell from these still images, but so all of these objects have very little jitter, or very low jitter. Okay, so I talked about the requirements for tracking, and I talked about so where we are today in terms of the technology. So now I'd like to talk about what's in store or what's next. What do we need to do to make this technology truly ubiquitous? So the path to ubiquitous use. So this is where we are today. We basically have spatial awareness. So we're able to do 6 degrees of freedom tracking, and we're also able to do obstacle avoidance because we understand the space around us. So this is today. And we believe the next step is object awareness. So instead of just saying, hey, there's something in front of me, I should avoid it, now the software can tell you, hey, that's actually a TV in front of you, that's a coffee table in front of you, or that's a couch. And once you have that, I mean, besides sort of these obvious, e-commerce type applications that you can think of, you can really start, in addition to that, you can really start catering the experience to the environment of the user. So if I have my headset on, I could be sitting on my couch. There could be a virtual character that pops up, sits next to me on the couch, and he can place his virtual coffee cup on the table in front of me. So it can really open up a slew of different experiences that aren't available today. Excuse me. And lastly, the next step behind object awareness is context awareness. So now that we know what's around us, so now we can figure out where the user is. So if there's a couch, a TV, and a coffee table, then maybe he's in the living room. And perhaps we can even tell what the user is up to. So if we can see that the user is about to watch TV, we can perhaps recommend some shows that the user can watch. So we can make some intelligent recommendations. If the user's in his kitchen and he's about to start cooking, maybe we can recommend some recipes. And once we get to that point, we can have this sort of truly intelligent digital assistant that identifies and understands the user's surroundings and can provide recommendations that are truly meaningful and intelligent. And at that point, I think we can really get to that place where the technology is useful and necessary for the average user. And that's it. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Okay, can we bring up the questions? What hardware does this run on?
I mean, are we talking about compute or cameras or? So generally, we're purely a software company. So without getting into too much detail, we're hardware agnostic. We can port to whatever. So it's dictated by our OEM customer. So we can port to whatever hardware they want to run on, obviously with trade-offs depending on the horsepower that's provided. As far as the cameras go, we use depth cameras. So we need dense depth. So it doesn't matter if it's time of flight, structured light, or active stereo. We're able to, as long as we get the depth data, we're able to work. Do we have a, no, not this time. Hopefully in the future. But if anybody is interested in a demo, you can come talk to me. We can perhaps arrange a visit to the office. We take visitors, so you guys are welcome to come.
So we have a few extra minutes if anyone else has any questions for our speaker.
I was going to ask you this privately, but I'll go ahead and do it.
Sure.
Because it's kind of an off-the-wall question, but
Yep.
I'm a climate science, environmental science teacher for the Climate
Interesting.
Institute, and I'm wondering
Okay.
has anybody done geography in a house? So your living room suddenly becomes the Greenland ice sheet, and you can see the scale of the maritime shipping or the damage done by industry or what have you, and actually wander around a topographically correct environment.
Interesting question. So you're saying, I mean, if I kind of scan my floor, can there be topographical differences?
Right.
Kind of
Okay.
as I traverse? Yeah.
You're over there in North Carolina.
Yeah.
I'm over here in Utah, right? Those are the Rocky Mountains right there between us. And I want to talk, and we're going to look at them in this room instead of this row of chairs. And I'm going to say, hey, you know how many glaciers are left in Glacier National Park? 1. You want to know how small it is? Well, let's look at it. And we walk around, and you're actually seeing something besides a grizzly bear with, something besides some guy with a shotgun or a laser trying to off your puppy or whatever the heck game into people are doing. You're actually looking at something that's geographically, topographically accurate and is communicating real science. Is that an off-the-wall idea or what?
No, I mean, it sounds awesome, right? So as long as, I mean, we don't control so for us, we provide mapping and tracking. We don't when we have some demos in-house, but we don't build experiences that run on top of it. We're more of an enabler.
That hasn't been done yet, to your knowledge.
I mean, perhaps there's something downstairs, but yeah, I personally haven't seen it.
So there's some interesting things, some interesting demos that HoloLens has put together, and you can probably look for those on YouTube, where it's not specifically, your exact use case, but being able to explore Mars and stuff like that using augmented reality. It's being done, and I think you'll find some cool examples out there.